fighting the COVID-19 pandemic demanded huge restrictions in behavior. One of these is a restriction in travel. Over this past year, we've seen positive impacts on this, especially on the environment, for example, lower emissions. But for how long will these impacts have an effect? What will happen in the new normal? Also, besides all this positive impact, what negative consequences followed this restriction? For example, a loss of cultural interaction and also discovering new places. Is the solution that we learned from COVID to restrict our travel activities in the new normal, or are there innovative solutions that can help the problem? Hello and welcome back to COVID-Wise Media. For today's interview, we are very happy to speak to John Robinson. John is an environmental scientist, holds professorships at many leading universities, drives research in the areas of climate change and sustainability, and last but not least was a leading author on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which won a Nobel Peace Prize in 2007. Today he will speak to us about tourism in the COVID context. And as a little change, the interviewer will be Kai Hockerts, initiator of the COVID-Wise project.
Welcome everybody today. We are here with John Robinson, professor at the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy and the School of Environment at the University of Toronto. And John, I'm really happy to have you here today. You are also associated with the Copenhagen Business School. We're happy to have you over here on your interval trips to Europe, which probably were less in the last year. And the reason we're happy to work with you is that you are an expert on the question of sustainable design, buildings, and moving towards a more carbon neutral society. Now, before we get into the topic of today, perhaps if you talk a little bit about yourself and your experience working with the IPCC and how that has actually developed since then.
Sure. I was a lead author with the IPCC for the second, third, and fourth assessment report, so about 15 years. In the early 2000s, centered around then, when the issue was really about connecting climate change phenomena to mitigation and adaptation questions, and the sort of emergence of adaptation was happening at that time as a really serious issue to address, but also the mitigation arguments were maturing as well. And so I think what's happened since then is not so much what's happened in the literature, in the science, but it has become more prominent. It's become more prevalently recognized. Certainly, there's a lot of now much more public awareness than there was then, perhaps. And there are the first attempts to really address and come to grips with climate change, not just as a phenomenon for governments to deal with, but for the rest of society to engage. Opportunities for the private sector, for entrepreneurs, but also for individuals, for NGOs and civil society. So I think there's just a much greater engagement these days with climate change issues. The other thing I'd say is a recognition that it's not just about climate change. That climate change intersects with a lot of other sustainability issues. It intersects with other environmental issues, but also with a bunch of social issues like poverty and employment and health and so on. And so those interconnections, I think, are a little more apparent now than they were then.
Okay, so how has the last year affected the planet, right? We all have been cooped up in our lockdowns here in Denmark at the moment. We are still being in lockdown, hoping to get out of it after Easter, but who knows what happens. The global supply chains have been disrupted. How big an effect has that had? Is everything fine now, or was this really just a tiny little dent in a permanently moving up curve?
Unfortunately, it's more the latter than the former, but it depends a lot by sector. If you look at travel, for example, business air travel has basically disappeared. So the airlines and tourism. So the airlines have seen a precipitous drop. But if you look at overall carbon emissions, one estimate I've seen is they dropped about 8%. And I think that's a really important finding because that tells us something about what kinds of things will work and won't work. And shutting things down doesn't seem to be the solution to carbon emissions. And we also see this phenomena I don't know if you've heard the term revenge travel. I ran across it recently. It's
Oh,
people who are just, they're so pent up, they're so dying to travel that they're just going to burst out of the cocoon. And so some people are anticipating a huge upsurge of
to catch up
travel.
after the crisis.
Yeah. I'm not sure if revenge is the right term, but that's the way it was described. But I do think we will see an increase again. And so the pandemic certainly hasn't solved the problem for us. We need much more deep and wide-ranging solutions than simply hunkering down in our homes and not traveling.
To put these 8% into context, what would be the goal? Of course, net, we want to get to a zero, if possible. But when you say 8%, is that net, or is that in the brutto emissions that were there without the
that's a dip
activities?
A dip in the overall emissions, global emissions, and it varies by country, it varies by sector, as I said. But that was one number I saw as an overall effect. I don't think we really know yet. The people are doing the calculations. They're trying to figure out what the effect would be, but it certainly isn't a permanent turn in emissions. And as I said, if we see a big upsurge in travel, for example, again afterwards, then we're in the same situation of continuing growth. And we have to find some way fundamentally to decouple our activities from carbon emissions. Either through reduced activities of various kinds, and lots of people are trying out different ways to do that, but also increased efficiencies. That's a crucial part of it. And then fuel switching away from carbon intensive fuels. I mean, we all three of those things are in play now, I think.
So looking at the patterns that might be kind of like scalable after the crisis, one of the few things I found really interesting is the local tourism. So everybody I talk to basically tells me, you know what, this is the first time since ever that I've visited my own country, and we have traveled extensively in Denmark after having been living here for 16 years. We were quite adventurous the first couple of years and interested in finding out all the different parts, and lately have actually been not traveling a lot in Denmark, but rather in other places in Europe or abroad even. And now the last year really has given us a lot of insights into areas that we normally wouldn't have. We probably wanted to visit the whole time and never really did. We actually have quite a number of friends who have bought summer houses, so that of course will have an effect on their behavior as well. Online conferencing is kind of like another thing. So what are your thoughts about that? These changes in behavior that you would call more like local consumption, local activities?
I think there's a bunch of different things. First of all, we want to differentiate between sort of tourism-based travel and business travel, right? There are two different things, and I think the lessons are maybe a little different in each. On the tourism front, we're interested in or let me back up a minute. On the sustainability front, we're interested in what we call regenerative sustainability, which means human activity that doesn't have to be reduced because it's damaging, but human activity that actually improves both environmental outcomes and human well-being simultaneously. Because obviously that's the kind of activity we want, where we can find it. Sometimes all we can do is reduce harm, but sometimes we can have net positive impacts. So when we turn
the more we have of that, the better that would be, right?
Absolutely. We want regenerative industrial systems, transportation systems, cities, and so on. If we turn to tourism, what we see is a phenomenon that's having increasingly negative environmental impacts, of course, because of all the carbon emissions, but also social and cultural impacts. It's no accident that in many cities in Europe, people kind of vacate the city in August because of the massive influx of tourists, and even more significant impacts in other parts of the world, for example. So there is this movement that has started called regenerative tourism, which says, can we find ways that the tourism experience itself actually helps local economies, local cultures, local societies, and does not do environmental damage, if anything, makes things better. So I think that's not a function of how far you travel in principle. but it is in practice because of the carbon associated with air travel. But I think the larger issue here is travel itself is not the problem. It's the consequences of travel that we're trying to mitigate, both cultural, social, economic, but also especially environmental in terms of carbon emissions. So I'm a fan of that concept of regenerative tourism. Can we find ways that allow people to travel? I think it's good to interact. It's good to learn more about other cultures and other societies. We need more cooperation and knowledge about each other, not less. But we're faced with this intractable problem that all of that travel, and now we move into the business travel side of things also, has these unavoidable carbon impacts. So I'd like to make a distinction between short-term and long-term here. In the short term, we just have to reduce those emissions. And that's going to be a combination of the three things I mentioned, reducing travel and virtualizing it, replacing it wherever possible. And I think we're going to see more and more of that in the business world, a lot more virtual travel, a lot more meetings and conferences that happen, via various online platforms. We're going to see greater efficiency. We have to. All our vehicles, not just planes, but all vehicles have to become substantially more efficient. And then we have to do fuel switching. We have to find non-carbon ways of fueling our transportation devices, whatever sector they're in. So I think that's the short-term agenda, really big push on all three of those things. And I'm optimistic about the first of them because I do think people have learned we can do a lot of things remotely that we used to think we couldn't do remotely. And so I think that's a really good thing. We now have options that where, the whole University of Toronto, I'm sure CBS was the same, went online in 2 weeks. Everything, every single class. That no one would have believed we could do that, or no one would have tried to even suggest it, but it happened. So that's a very positive thing on that first of those three strategies. But that's the short-term agenda. The long-term agenda, I think, is to support travel if we can find ways to make it carbon-free and not damaging culturally, then we should be, in the long term, celebrating travel as a way of getting to know each other in a world where global collaboration and cooperation is crucial. So I do think it's a time sense. It depends a bit on the time frame. And so I think we need innovation in all of those three areas that I mentioned in the short term. Innovation in telecommunication substitution. We're doing that. We're kind of living through that innovation, but there's more that can be done in efficiency gains and in fuel switching. So there's lots of opportunity for innovative entrepreneurial activity in those three domains. And then in the longer term, we're talking about a changed world, right? Where this isn't just happening in transportation. This has to happen in every other sector as well. So there's all kinds of opportunities there to try and anticipate, what that world might look like. But I think that is a longer term issue.
Mm-hmm. So thinking of the people watching our interview series here, many of them are emerging social entrepreneurs. They're interested in coming up with an entrepreneurial idea to address environmental social problems. What advice would you give them? Like which solutions should they be focusing on? How should they think about the problems that are there, and where should they put their energy?
Depends a bit on what their area of expertise is, because those three areas, the three short-term areas I mentioned, each demand a different kind of entrepreneurialism. So if we're talking about telecommunication substitution, that there's a whole tech dimension to that, right? And it has to do with ITC, information and ICT, information and communications technology. So that's a whole area of innovation. Right now, it's dominated by a couple of big platforms that is the problem in general in the ICT world, is these huge monolithic companies, and then a sort of ecosystem of small consulting firms and innovative startups that are trying to make their way in that environment. So that's one whole path, and I think there's some really exciting possibilities there as we learn as we suffer from massive Zoom fatigue, and we run into the barriers of the online world. What are ways that we can make that experience much more palatable and more effective for people? So I think that's a whole arena that there's lots of things to be done there. And there's
a very simple idea that kind of like probably it already exists. I would expect that somebody's working on it, but a very simple thing I've been wondering about is applause, right? So if you need kind of like this immediate feedback, which laughter could be another one, right? So if there's a possibility in these online environments to give that kind of feedback without it becoming too artificial, of course we can put a smiley or a thumbs up or clapping the hand emoji. But I think it would be useful if there was actually a real possibility where people can just push a button, and depending on how long they push, clapping comes, and the more people do it at the moment, the more support you show, to have this this direct interaction with the speaker and the audience, which I think is missing in the virtual world.
Exactly. We have a concept in the building sector we call interactive adaptivity. Can we start to create conversations between the people in a building? We call them inhabitants, not occupants, because we think an inhabitant might have a sense of place in and engagement with the building. Can we create a conversation between the inhabitants and the building itself through these processes of interactive adaptivity, of a continuing conversation of getting closer and closer to the two sets of goals? Because my goal as somebody sitting in an office or at home is different than the building manager's goal about, say, reducing energy, increasing energy efficiency or whatever. Can we create these processes through window signaling systems, through other kinds of processes where a conversation is created between people and the infrastructure they inhabit that's aimed at satisfying both the overall goals of that infrastructure and people's needs? So I think there's a huge area there. Right now, people you can go to work, you don't know how it's heated or cooled, you don't even know where the controls are. You could use if anyone had ever told you where the controls are. So you're completely detached from your whole physical environment, the human-made physical environment. Could we create processes that allow people to feel more like inhabitants, to feel more of a sense of control over their the life in which they live? So that's a massive area. The second area that I mentioned is efficiency gains, and here there's huge opportunities for new technology. We've just seen that happen over the last 20 years. Is all kinds of energy efficiency we never even thought of before. And it's not just energy. Energy is the key in terms of the carbon equation, but there's lots of other environmental and human impacts from associated with water and air quality and so on and so forth. So there's a lot of work to be done there, I think. And then finally, for the highly tech-oriented companies, there's the fuel question, the fuel mix and fuel substitution. What are low carbon or zero carbon fuels? Could we imagine actually that process being net positive? We built a building in Vancouver that actually improved people's health, productivity, and subjective well-being, and was net positive in terms of carbon.
How did it do that?
Well, it took us a long time because we had to raise all the money for the building ourselves, or most of it, before the university came on board. But we designed a building that was intended to be net positive in energy, structural carbon, operational carbon, and water quality. And of those four, two of them worked. The carbon ones worked, and we did that mainly by building a wood building. So this is a huge development in the last 20 years, mass timber, using wood for structural elements, not steel and concrete. And that's a huge saving in the energy required to produce the material, but it also sequesters carbon. Wood is the only building material that actually sequesters carbon. So that's how we did it on the carbon front. In terms of health, productivity, and happiness, we tried to design a building. You have to do a lot of environmental things to improve people's health and their productivity. So natural light is really important. So designing with narrow floor plates on an east-west trajectory so that you get full penetration of daylighting. Then you have glare issues with a lot of daylighting, so you got to deal with that. Building with wood, it turns out to, in our post-occupancy evaluations, to have a huge impact on people's feelings of comfort and happiness in the building is a lot of exposed wood. We didn't expect that. We expected the air quality issue to be big, and we expected a few other things, but wood turned out to be important in that. Then the design of the building itself, it's entirely modular in the sense that all the floors except all the walls except the load-bearing walls are movable, so it's reconfigurable. That saves a lot of energy as building occupancy changes over time and new people move in and move out. It can be up to 25% of the total energy use of a building over a 25-year life is just the cost of moving things around when new occupants come in. So there are a whole bunch of different things. We put full sewage treatment in the building itself. That's one of the things that didn't work, so that we didn't achieve that target. But we hit 5 of the 7 net positive targets in that building. And my feeling is we shouldn't be building any buildings that aren't designed in this way. Why are we? Every building we build that isn't highly sustainable is a 50 to 100-year mistake. And it's way more expensive to retrofit it than to build it right in the first place. So we really need to up our game on building design and construction, I think.
I know we're coming to the end of the interview, but I have one more question that I wanted to ask you regarding the sequestration part, right? If we look at the trend of CO2 emissions at the moment, that even under optimistic assumptions will take a while to turn around, if at all. What is your understanding of where we are in terms of sequestration research, and is that something that will in the near future lead to results that will allow us to sequestrate, meaning to take large amounts of CO2 out of the atmosphere permanently?
Yeah, this is a huge area, and it's really in transition. There's a couple of different dimensions. The one I know the best is the one I mentioned a minute ago: carbon sequestration through the use of wood as a building material. We have a huge sequestration agenda this century. We got to sequester a lot of carbon. So I think we should be moving very rapidly towards mass timber construction techniques. So that's one arena of it. But of course, the others have to do with land use and forestry and agriculture. And those are really complex domains. It's hard even to do the calculations. Forests, for example, move through periods of being net sinks and net sources over time, depending on succession levels and so on. So there's real issues there. Plus, there's all the problems of additionality and permanence. When you do something to sequester carbon in that way, will it still be there in 10 years? And so on. So it's very complex, but I do think it's a really big agenda item for us as a society to figure out ways to sequester carbon. And that's not even talking about CCS and carbon sequestration through industrial processes, or pulling carbon out of the air, or removing it from the stack before the emission occurs, and so on. So that's a whole other technology that there's a lot of attention being paid to. I think that one is happening. There's a lot of focus on it right now. The forestry and agriculture land use side of things, I think, needs tons of work and needs lots of innovation to figure out how to do that and how to manage it. It's often a management problem. And then the carbon sequestration in the building industry is only just getting started, I think.
Okay, excellent. John, thank you very much for taking the time to talk to us today. I hope we'll be interacting again in person at a not too far point in the future. And yes, thank you very much.
Okay, Kai, my pleasure.
Thanks to the two of you. And as always, if you have enjoyed this format, either as a video or a podcast, please hit like, subscribe to our channel, and tell your friends about us. Feel inspired? Head to our website covid-wise.org and find out how to get involved. Covid-Wise is a production by the social business model Panorama and Copenhagen Business School.